Welcome back to Horror Galaxy. Tonight, I have 5 farm true horror stories for you. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the Horror Galaxy, you don't walk alone. I was already halfway through the head count when I stopped, boots sunk into dry dirt, counting again under my breath because the number didn't make sense. I had locked every gate myself the night before. I remembered the weight of the chain, the click of the padlock, the way my fingers smelled like rust afterward. Still, there was one more cow standing in the far end of the paddock than there should have been, and my stomach dropped as I counted them again. Slower this time, forcing calm into my voice, even though no one was listening. I walked the fence line first, because that's what you do when something's off. You look for the simple explanation. Broken wire, a post down, someone careless, but the fence was clean, tight, and uncut. No gaps, no fresh marks. The gate was still locked, chain untouched, dust undisturbed. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, trying to convince myself I'd miscounted the night before. I hadn't. I kept records. I always had. That was my job. Nights alone give you habits, and mine was writing numbers down twice. I went back to the shed, flipped open the logbook, and there it was in my own handwriting from the previous night. Same total I'd remembered. One less than what stood breathing in the paddock now. The extra cow didn't behave right. It stayed at the edge of the herd, never close enough to touch another animal, never far enough to wander off. When I stepped closer, it lifted its head and stared at me longer than livestock should. Not startled, not curious, just fixed. I felt stupid standing there, with my pulse racing over a cow. So I turned away and told myself to bring it up with the owner in the morning. By the next dawn, the count was off again. One more, 2 extra now. Same locked gate, same unbroken fence. I checked for calves, walked among them slowly, counting tags, checking flanks. No new births, no missing mothers. The new cattle didn't have brands I recognized, and that bothered me more than the numbers. You work long enough on a station, you know the markings like faces. I started marking the ground. I needed proof I wasn't losing it. That's when I noticed the hoofprints. They didn't lead to the fence. They didn't come from outside. They pointed inward, all of them, angled straight toward the quarters where I slept. I followed them until they stopped just short of my door. The dirt pressed deep like something heavy had stood there a long time. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bunk with my boots on, listening to the quiet that comes before animals settle. When the sound came, it wasn't loud. Just a low shifting, the scrape of hooves too close to the building. I told myself cattle wander. They lean. They rest. Still, I didn't open the door. At first light, there were 3 more. I radioed the owner. He laughed, said maybe I'd found a miracle herd, told me to stop counting and get some rest. His voice sounded thin, distant, like he didn't believe his own joke. When I asked him how many head he thought we had, he hesitated before answering. His number matched my book, not the paddock. I decided then to remove them. Simple. Load the extras and take them off the land. I opened the yards, herded carefully, sweat slick on my back. The known cattle moved fine. The others lagged, resisted, hooves digging in. One by one, they stopped responding to noise, to motion, to me standing in front of them, waving my arms, and shouting until my throat hurt. When I reached out to touch one, my hand hovered inches from its hide. I don't know how to explain it without sounding mad, but it felt wrong, like touching something that was pretending. I pulled back. I left them where they stood. That evening, the count rose again. I didn't bother writing it down. The prints came back, clearer this time. More of them. Pressed hard into the dirt, layered over each other, all pointing at the door. I locked myself inside and pushed the table against it. I kept the light on, watched the wall, and waited. Something brushed the side of the building after midnight. A long, slow drag, then another. I heard breathing, not snorting, not animal, measured, patient. I pressed my hand over my mouth and stayed still until my legs cramped and my eyes burned. Morning came anyway. It always does. The paddock was crowded now, full in a way it never had been. The extras stood closer, bodies packed tight, blocking my view of the real herd. I realized then that I couldn't see the originals clearly anymore. Couldn't tell where they ended and the others began. I called the owner again. This time he didn't laugh. He drove out and stood beside me, silent, counting. He stopped halfway through, face pale, and asked me how long it had been happening. When I told him, he swore softly and said he'd seen it once before, years back, when his father ran the place. We didn't talk much after that. We opened the outer gate together. Not to let them out. To give them somewhere to go. He told me not to watch, but I did. The extra cattle turned as one, moving away from the quarters, their prints finally pointing outward. They crossed the boundary and kept going, thinning as they walked, until the paddock looked right again. When it was over, the count matched. Perfectly. I left the station that day. I never worked nights again. Sometimes, though, I wake up certain I hear hooves outside, stopping just short of wherever I'm sleeping, as if counting how many of us are inside now. I was halfway down my assigned row when I heard my name said clearly enough that I stopped pulling tassels and turned my head without thinking. I even answered a quick, yeah, tossed over my shoulder, because it sounded exactly like the way Mark called me when he needed help untangling his sleeves. No one answered back. The corn stood still around me, rose tight enough that I couldn't see past the next bend, and I felt embarrassed for reacting so fast. I went back to work, snapping the tassel free, tossing it down, moving forward with the rhythm I'd settled into after weeks in the field. A few steps later, my name came again, closer this time. Softer, like someone leaning in so the supervisor wouldn't hear. It used my nickname, the one my sister used, the one I hadn't heard out here at all. I froze with my hands still raised, fingers gripping dry leaves. I told myself voices carry strangely in the corn. Everyone says that. Sound bends. Echoes travel. I forced my legs to move, heart thudding harder than the work justified. When I reached the end of the row, I glanced sideways, expecting to see someone grinning, ready to scare me. The neighboring row was empty. By lunch, 3 of us had heard it. Not the same voice, not the same words. Just our own names, spoken the way someone close to us would say them. We joked about it. The way you do when something unsettles you and you don't want to give it weight. Someone said, maybe we were all just tired. Someone else said the corn was messing with us. I laughed along. But I didn't mention that the voice I'd heard had used my nickname again. The afternoon dragged. Every rustle made my shoulders tighten. Once I heard my name followed by a full sentence. Something I'd said to my mother on the phone the night before about wanting to quit and come home. The words were exact. I stood there, breathing through my mouth, knowing no one else could have heard that conversation. I didn't answer. I finished my row and switched with another worker, hoping new ground would mean quiet. It didn't. The voices started repeating things I hadn't said yet, complaints I'd been forming in my head, jokes I was about to make. When I whispered to myself that I was done for the day, my own voice came back to me from 2 rows over, already tired, already resigned. That was when I felt something tip inside me, fear outweighing reason. At the end of the shift, I stayed close to the others, talking too much, filling the air with noise. The sun was dropping when we packed up, and the supervisor called out reminders for the next morning. As people peeled off toward the trucks, I realized I'd left my gloves behind. I hesitated, then told myself not to be stupid. It was just gloves. I jogged back into the rows alone. I found them quickly, hanging from a stalk where I'd wedged them earlier. As I grabbed them, my name floated through the corn again, calm and familiar. This time it sounded like my sister laughing. She said a sentence I hadn't spoken yet, something about stopping for food on the way home. I felt a strange relief wash over me, like being recognized. Without thinking, I answered, "Yeah, I'm coming," I said, pushing into the row the voice came from. The corn closed around me. The air felt thicker, heavy in my chest. The voice kept talking, asking questions, carrying on a conversation that stayed just ahead of me. I responded automatically, annoyed at first, then confused as my replies seemed to come before the questions. I realized I was hearing my own words, spoken back to me seconds before I said them. Panic finally snapped me awake. I stopped walking and shouted for the others. No one answered. The rows looked the same in every direction. Green walls swallowing sound. My name came again, firmer now, telling me which way to go. I shook my head, covered my ears, and tried to breathe. I don't know how long I stood there. Time felt folded in on itself. Eventually, I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped responding. I closed my mouth and listened. The voice filled the silence anyway, using my voice now, repeating things I remembered saying years ago, things I wished I'd never said. It started to argue with itself, my tone shifting, overlapping, crowding my head until I screamed. The moment I screamed, everything went quiet. I ran. I pushed through stalks without caring about scratches, moving toward where I thought the edge should be. When I burst out into open space, I fell to my knees, sobbing so hard I couldn't speak. The trucks were gone. The field was empty. I staggered to the road and flagged down a passing car, barely able to explain where I'd been. When I got back to the camp office later that night, everyone stared at me like they'd seen a ghost. The supervisor kept asking where I'd been. Mark looked sick. Someone said my name like they were testing it. When I asked what was wrong, no one answered at first. Finally, the supervisor told me they'd searched the field when I didn't come out. They said they'd heard my voice calling to them from deep in the rows, answering their questions, telling them I was fine and walking out on my own. They said they followed it until it stopped. They all insisted I never came out of the corn. I quit that night. I never went back. I don't detassel. I don't walk through fields taller than me. Sometimes, though, when I'm about to say something, I hear it spoken softly just ahead of my thoughts, and I bite my tongue hard enough to bleed, afraid that if I answer, I won't find my way back out again. I was dragging the empty buckets back toward the barn when I heard the splash, sharp and hollow, like plastic hitting water far below ground. I froze mid-step, my arms burning, because the sound came from the direction of the old well, the one my parents had sealed years before I was born. No one went near it. Everyone knew that. Still, I set the buckets down and walked closer, my heart beating fast for no reason I could explain. The concrete lid was wrong. I knew that immediately. It had always been flat and grey, heavy enough that my father said it took 2 men to move. Now it sat crooked, one edge lifted just enough to show black space underneath. Rainwater pooled around it, dark and still. I knelt and leaned forward, holding my breath, and that was when I heard it again. Another splash, smaller this time, like something light being dropped. I called out without thinking, just a quick hello, the way kids do when they want reassurance. My voice fell straight down into the well and didn't come back. That scared me more than the sound. I stood up fast and backed away, telling myself someone must have been messing around, even though no one else was home, and my parents never let visitors wander the property alone. I finished my chores badly, rushing through them, glancing over my shoulder too often. When my mother came out later and asked why the buckets were half full, I shrugged and said I'd spilled. I didn't mention the well. I don't know why. Something about it felt like a secret that would get me in trouble just for saying out loud. That night, rain hit the roof hard enough to wake me. I lay there listening to it soak into the ground, thinking about the lid shifted just enough to let water through. At some point, I heard the splash again, faint but clear, drifting through the open window. Then another. Then a sound that made my chest tighten, a soft clatter like a toy knocking against stone. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went straight to the well. The lid was back in place, perfectly flat, clean as if it had never moved. I stood there longer than I needed to, waiting for something to happen, but the yard was quiet. When my father caught me staring, he told me to get back to work and stay away from that spot. His voice was sharper than usual. After the next rain, it happened again. The lid shifted. The splashing started. This time, I stayed hidden behind the barn, peeking out. I heard something bounce against the water, followed by a faint squeak. I knew that sound. It was the rubber duck I'd lost when I was younger, the one that had vanished during a bath and never turned up again. Hearing it down there made my skin crawl. I whispered for it to stop. The sound answered with another splash. I started finding my old things around the well. A cracked plastic shovel, a ball with teeth marks from our old dog, items that had disappeared years earlier, turning up wet and clean, arranged neatly near the lid. I tried throwing one back in. It landed with a splash, and moments later, something else hit the water like a reply. When I finally told my mother, she went pale. She grabbed my arm too hard and pulled me inside, asking what I'd seen, what I'd heard. When I mentioned toys, she covered her mouth and sat down hard. That evening, my parents argued in low voices behind the kitchen door. I caught words like sealed, accident, and not again. They poured concrete over the lid the next day. Thick, fresh, ugly concrete that spread wider than before. My father worked until his hands shook. He wouldn't look at me. That night, it rained harder than I'd ever heard it rain, and beneath the sound of it, I heard the splashing start again, louder now, angrier. The concrete cracked. I watched it happen from my window, the lines spreading like a vein. The next morning, the crack was gone. The surface smooth. I didn't go near it after that. I avoided the barn entirely. Still, after every storm, I'd hear the sounds drifting up through the ground, not just splashing anymore. Rolling, bumping, the unmistakable noise of small things being played with. Sometimes I heard my name, said the way my cousin used to say it when we played hide and seek. Years later, after my parents died, I learned the truth from a neighbor who'd known the farm before we did. There had been a child once, another family, an accident during a storm. The well had been sealed after, filled in too fast, too quiet. The toys were never removed. I sold the property soon after. On the day I left, rain clouds gathered. I stood by the old well one last time, listening. From deep below, something splashed, followed by the faint, hopeful squeak of a rubber duck. I didn't answer. I walked away and never looked back. I was tightening the last bolt on the tractor when I noticed the seat was gone. And for a second I honestly thought I'd gone mad. I stood there staring at the bare metal post where it should have been, my hands still greasy, my brain refusing to catch up. I had driven that tractor in less than 12 hours earlier. I remembered sitting there, bouncing over uneven ground, cursing the padding that was starting to split. Now there was nothing. I walked a slow circle around the machine, checking the ground, the shed, the nearby grass, expecting to see it tossed aside as a joke. There was no one around to joke with. The farm was quiet except for sheep shifting in the paddock. I touched the post where the seat should have been, half expecting it to still feel warm from memory. It was cold. I told myself someone must have borrowed it. That made no sense either, but it was better than the alternative. I grabbed a spare from an older tractor and fitted it on, annoyed but distracted by the day's work. By afternoon, I'd pushed the thought aside. The next morning, I found the missing seat in the lower field, sitting upright in the grass like it had been placed there carefully. I walked out to it slowly, my boots wet, heart starting to pound. When I touched it, I pulled my hand back instinctively. It was warm, not sun-warmed, body warm. The seat faced uphill, angled directly toward the farmhouse. I carried it back, telling myself heat lingers, telling myself orientation means nothing. I reattached it and worked the rest of the day with an edge I couldn't shake. That night, before bed, I checked the shed. The tractor sat where I'd left it. The seat was there. It was gone again in the morning. This time, I didn't swear. I didn't even feel surprised. I just stood there, breathing slowly, looking at the empty post. I went straight to the fields. I found it near the fence line, closer to the house than before. Warm, facing me. I mentioned it to the owner over breakfast, trying to sound casual. He laughed once, then stopped when he saw my face. He asked if I'd been sleeping properly. I told him yes. That was a lie. He said old farms do strange things and changed the subject. He didn't come out to look. The pattern continued. Every night, the seat vanished. Every morning, it appeared somewhere else, always closer, always warm, always turned toward the farmhouse. I started marking its position with stakes, measuring the distance. It moved a little more each time, like someone walking it in step by step. I locked the shed one night and kept the key on the bedside table. I didn't sleep. When dawn came, the lock was still intact. The tractor sat untouched. The seat was gone. I found it at the edge of the yard. Warm enough that steam rose faintly when I set it down. I felt sick holding it, like I was interrupting something private. That night, I hid and waited. I watched from the darkened shed, my heart thudding loud in my ears. Hours passed. Then, just after I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it. A dull scrape. Metal against wood. The tractor didn't start. Nothing mechanical moved. The seat lifted slowly from its post, drifting down like it weighed nothing at all. I wanted to run. I couldn't. It moved across the yard, steady, deliberate, stopping now, and then as if adjusting its direction. It faced the farmhouse. It always did. I followed at a distance, shaking, every instinct screaming at me to stop. It crossed into the grass and settled near the back door. When it stopped, the warmth hit my face like breath. The door creaked open behind me. The owner stood there, pale, eyes fixed on the seat. He told me quietly that his father used to sit out there after dark, watching the house, waiting for his wife to come back. She never did. He stayed on the tractor until his heart gave out, hands frozen on the wheel. We didn't touch the seat. We left it where it was until morning. At first light, it was cold. We burned it that day. The smell was awful. The tractor never lost another part. I left the farm soon after. Sometimes, when I wake at night, I feel that same warmth at my back, like something sitting patiently behind me, facing home. I was halfway through labeling the crates when I noticed the date didn't make sense, and I stood there, staring at the bottle in my hand, like it might explain itself if I waited long enough. The milk inside was smooth, white, and perfectly still. It should have smelled sour by then. It should have separated or curdled or shown anything wrong at all. Instead, it looked exactly like it had the morning it was collected. I set it down and opened it, already bracing for the smell that never came. I leaned closer, then closer still, until I was sure. Nothing, no sharpness, no rot. I dipped a finger in despite knowing better and tasted it, just a drop, because I needed proof. It tasted fresh, warm, like it had just been poured. I checked the source tag again. Same cow as always. The brown one with the white blaze on her forehead. Everyone called her Lucera. She wasn't special in any obvious way. She didn't produce more than the others. She didn't get sick. She just stood quietly, chewing, watching people pass with calm eyes that never blinked at the wrong time. I reported it the way I was supposed to. The supervisor frowned, told me to dump the batch, said contamination could work both ways. I did what he said, poured it down the drain, watched it disappear without resistance. The next day, the same thing happened. Another bottle. Same cow, same impossible freshness. I started keeping one back. I hid it in my locker, telling myself it was curiosity, that it was harmless. Days passed. Then a week. The milk stayed the same. I unscrewed the cap once a day, smelled it, watched for change. Nothing ever happened. It felt like time refused to touch it. I stopped telling anyone. I didn't want the questions. I didn't want to hear myself explain it out loud. When Lucera was sold, I felt a sharp, unexpected relief. The truck came early. I watched her go, her hooves clacking softly on the ramp, her head turning once toward the building where I stood. I told myself it was over. The first bottle appeared on my doorstep 3 days later. I almost kicked it by accident, stepping out half awake before my shift. It stood upright, sealed, clean, label blank. I picked it up and felt the weight settle into my palm. It was warm, like it had been carried there by hand. My name was written on the cap in neat, careful letters. I didn't open it. I left it inside all day, untouched, sitting on the kitchen table like a guest waiting to be acknowledged. When I came home that night, it hadn't moved. I threw it away without looking at it again. The next morning, there were 2. I stopped sleeping. Every sound outside made my stomach tighten. I checked the lock twice, then 3 times. I started finding bottles not just at the door, but on the windowsill, on the step outside my bedroom, once on my pillow when I came home late, always sealed, always fresh, always warm. I tried pouring one out. The milk wouldn't flow. I tipped it harder, shook it, watched it cling to the glass as if it didn't recognize gravity. When I finally smashed the bottle in the sink, the milk pooled thickly, refusing to drain, spreading until I had to wipe it away by hand. I went back to the farm and demanded answers. The owner avoided my eyes. He admitted Lucera had never been slaughtered. She'd been sent somewhere else after the buyer returned her. Said she wouldn't stop producing. Said the milk wouldn't turn even in heat. They'd buried her behind the old storage shed when she collapsed, still warm, still leaking white into the dirt. That night, I followed the sound to my door. I opened it before I could stop myself. A bottle stood there, uncapped this time, steam curling from its mouth. I understood then. I picked it up, walked to the sink, and drank. It tasted like endings. The bottles stopped after that.